All right, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from in the world, or I guess maybe good morning. I don't know all the time zones. Welcome to Crazy Talk. If this is your first time watching Crazy Talk, I'm your host, Lee Thomas, and Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV show where we interview all sorts of people about all sorts of things related to mental health. Like I said, I'm your host, Lee Thomas. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, thank you so much for coming back. I'm really glad we haven't, scared you off yet. And we really do love our people who tune in every week, whether you're watching it live or watching the replay. Be sure to, put some comments in the comment box, click that like button, click that love button. We love to see the little buttons pop up across the screen. We live for external validation, all that good stuff. So I'm really excited for this week's episode of Crazy Talk because I'm going to be joined by my friend Cody Jack. So Cody is originally from Oromocto, New Brunswick. He has a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of New Brunswick. His main area of study was political engagement, political theory, and political economy. It took him over 10 years to do it, but he is not ashamed of this fact. Cody was diagnosed in his early 20s with ADD, generalized anxiety disorder, dysgraphia, dyslexia, and dyscalculia. Cody has had a variety of jobs in the past. He's worked as a columnist with the UNB student newspaper, The Brunswickan, a co-host of a radio show at CHSR 97.9 FM, a residential carpenter in Edmonton, mountain bike coordinator, and ESL facilitator. Cody is concerned with the effects of neoliberal policies and rhetoric in relation to the mental health and well-being of members of society. And we're going to talk a lot about that today, so I'm really excited. Cody currently works as a language monitor with the Commission Scolaire du Chemin du Roi in Trois-Rivières, I butchered that, Quebec, and helps Francophone students in grades 7 and 8 to improve their conversational English. You'll often find him reading books at the gym or binging something on Netflix. Thank you so much for joining us, Cody. I'm really excited to have you here.
I'm happy to be here, Lee. It's good to hang out with you again.
Oh yeah. Well, we do again. Well, we're living across a province, across a country from each other now, so it's really good that we have this opportunity. Yeah, and it's a very special day that we're having this episode of Crazy Talk because it is legalization day.
Happy Weed Day, everybody.
Happy Weed Day. Yeah. So I feel like that's probably something that you might have some thoughts about. I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, I'm happy that the stigma is away from it in terms of the use of it as a recreational kind of drug. Alcohol is a recreational drug, as many other things that are legal in this country. But there's a lot of people that have been marginalized just on drug charges. Specifically Aboriginal Canadians and other marginalized groups in Canada. And so it's glad that that'll be over. Hopefully there'll be action to kind of get rid of their criminal records. So many people are, not having good times because of that. But I'm also worried on the flip side in terms of how we're going to deal with weed. There's a lot of people that are like, weed is now the cure-all drug. It's like everybody's, it's like the guy from My Big Fat Greek Wedding, the dad, who's like, put some Windex on it. It'll cure my elbow. And it's like, that's going to be weed now. It's just going to be some dude with a problem on his elbow putting weed on it because that'll cure it. So, I hope that now that it's legal, science, like we can look at it more, see what its effects for mental health, see what its effects are in terms of other things in kind of society. As well as if there are negative health effects, we should know about that too. But I think just taking the kind of veil off of weed is definitely a good thing. So, I'm pumped. And I'm also really happy that I got that Windex joke in. So, it's good times.
The one request, I'd like to get this Windex joke in.
Yeah.
But I think it's one of those things where people, when it comes to weed, it does tend to fall into like one of two camps. It's either like weed is the devil, or weed is the best drug that has ever happened. Like it is going to cure absolutely everything. And we see that in mental health too, where it does kind of get this very divided reputation where on the one hand, people are citing studies that show that weed increases like the risk of psychosis in people who are vulnerable, that it makes people more anxious, that it makes people more depressed. But then there are a lot of people on the other hand who are saying like, using pot has like cured my anxiety, or it's the only thing that works for my anxiety, or it's, it's helps with my depression. And I don't really have any answers around that. So I think you're right. Having that kind of veil lifted off of it, we might be able to get some answers or maybe more concrete answers.
Yeah, because most of our answers have been anecdotal because we haven't, scientists have only just recently been allowed to kind of experiment it. I mean, they were doing kind of experiments in the 70s and stuff, but it wasn't really allowed to be widely used in terms of research and stuff. So at least now we can actually do like longitudinal studies on, using a wide variety of the population. Not that like this should be a social experiment, but there will be benefits to the kind of veil being taken out. But thanks everybody for being human guinea pigs.
So, okay, so there's a lot to go in there. But I do want to bring it back to this kind of idea of incarceration, because that's something we hear a lot in conversations around marijuana, but also a lot in conversations around mental health, right? And I don't think that they're, discrete, separate issues necessarily, but a lot of the times we do kind of see in our kind of incarceration system and in our quote unquote justice system being used as kind of a storehouse for people with mental health and addictions issues. Storehouse is not the word I wanted to use there, but I couldn't think of a better one.
I think in some ways it's how they look at it, right? It's you're keeping problematic people out of the general population so that you're keeping the population, quote unquote, safe from these people. But then it's just, you use weed as kind of the way. It's an easy one because, a lot of people smoke weed. So, and a lot of marginalized groups smoke weed. So it's just an easy way. And there's a good thing I was reading earlier, and the comment I think keeps coming up, and it's that weed has been legal for many Canadians for years, and that I've never had any trouble with the law in terms of most things because of my status as a white male, so it's a heterosexual male. So it's like I haven't had those problems because of my social status. So it's not been legal for me, but it's been legal, and so I haven't had to face those things. Whereas a lot of other groups, it's like somebody has a joint, all of a sudden they're in jail for something, like the repercussions for other groups, and it used as a tool for incarceration and marginalization is just, So now that's off the table, but it's not like now they're not going to find some other reason to marginalize groups even more. So who knows? Yeah,
I read somewhere about a lot of Canadian forces were struggling, like police and stuff were struggling with their drug sniffing dogs are now kind of obsolete because they had these drug sniffing dogs to like sniff out cannabis, and now it doesn't matter. But the article that I read was saying that a lot of police forces were keeping their drug sniffing dogs on anyway. And the article was about like, does this not raise some questions about, who's going to get sniffed and stopped and searched for a substance that is perfectly legal, which I think is a really fair question.
Well, and it's because it's legal, but we've still highly regulated around it, right? So it's like you can't drive while you're high. And certain problems, like in some of the territories, you can't drive with weed in your vehicle. And certain, like you can't, it has to be in a certain location in the vehicle. Like, so there's still, each province has different regulations around it as a way of kind of doing that. So we don't have like a uniform patchwork, and it hasn't been really educated about what is legal and what is not legal from province to province. But it's also, again, we kind of tie drugs to mental health as well. And so it's like somebody's acting different on the street. It's like, oh no. And it's like, oh, I smell weed too. And it's like, it's just any sort of way to get into those things, as well as kind of using criminal law as a way of dealing with mental health. Has always been a long history of kind of a problematic way of doing it. Or kind of linking the two together, that criminal behavior is linked to kind of mental health issues as well. It's kind of a stigma that's been attached for a long time. So like the whole thing, hopefully will start a conversation around, what is legal, what's not legal, why do we incarcerate certain people and not other people, and move from there. I mean, that might be wishful thinking, but I think there is a conversation that started around it anyway.
Yeah. And I think that ties in really nicely with another topic that you kind of wanted to discuss, which was this idea of kind of neoliberalism and individuals and kind of collective approaches to mental health. And I think that we see that a lot, again, in that conversation around incarcerating people with mental health issues, where we keep kind of treating individuals with mental health issues as though they are like individuals, which I guess is they are individuals, but yes. You know what I mean? We're treating them as though they are acute cases, that every single person has equal chances to succeed, and somewhere along the lines, these people made the choice to
be mentally ill
or to engage in criminal activity, right?
Yeah.
And it's so I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that, because it's something that I guess don't have fully formed opinions on yet.
Well, and I was thinking with the weed, like when we were talking about how certain studies say weed is linked to certain aspects of psychosis, which might be led to criminal behavior kind of thing. So again, it's kind of like this person made the choice to smoke weed at a certain level of smoking weed, and then their actions are what led to the criminal behavior, right? But some things, when I was looking into things, when I was doing the research for this show, there was a couple of studies that were talking about kind of increased rates of individualization and how they were kind of marking individualization. A lot of that was divorce rates, I guess, and people living alone were two markers. This particular study that I read out of Psychology Today, Dr. Rob Whitley, and so he was pointing at those things as kind of different things. He also talked about Robert Putnam bowling alone, as you kind of remember from our readings in university, the lack of social capital. But then again, this person placed it back on kind of like people playing video games and isolating themselves, whereas like, and talked about social media, but social media is allowing us to engage with each other right now. So I'm not sure how much I buy the social media argument, but in terms of kind of the link between individualization, isolation, and mental health problems, I think there was another thing that kind of struck me about it that this study was missing, which another study I read was talking about was like socioeconomic aspects of individualization and how kind of the link between individualization in the rhetoric and kind of the culture of neoliberalism mixed with kind of the adverse economic effects of that. And this study actually showed, because there's kind of a chicken and an egg question that comes with socioeconomic status. It's like, did your mental health cause you to lose socioeconomic status, or did the socioeconomic status cause you to have mental health problems? Now, this study, everybody loves cherry picking information, and I just did it. But this study by Chris Hudson, 2005, he illustrated by looking at patients in Massachusetts that it was in fact the socioeconomic status that had adverse effects on the mental health, and that this was shown through all the other cases. He tried to kind of pair it with other things in terms of like race, gender, sex, and stuff like that, as well as kind of your family integration, so if your parents are divorced or not. But he showed that the one that was more consistent and had the strongest kind of statistical relevancy was socioeconomic status. So the lower your socioeconomic status, the more likely you were to have kind of a mental health crisis or a mental health issue, because sometimes mental health is a long-term thing, sometimes it's short-term, right? But what was interesting to me was that he also showed there is, the prevalence of mental health is like a genetic and kind of familial thing that just kind of happens. But he's also like, there was still a big, large enough percentage to show that the environment had a huge impact. And so I don't think we talk about that enough. Like, we don't talk about, because again, we associate your economic status with your individual choices. So we place so much burden on the individual to deal with their own mental health and the responsibility for their own mental health that to me is that's troubling, right? Even in university, it's like, you're responsible for your grades, you're responsible for everything, and then you're just sitting in your dorm room losing your mind because you've got all these things to do, but for some reason you're not supposed to ask other people for help. Like, there was kind of a stigma, or like not a stigma, but like, you are responsible for your success in university. So if you don't access those tools, it is your fault. And there was not like a sense of kind of community working together kind of thing. Even your classes, like sometimes you'd have study groups and stuff, but in certain other classes, depending on the culture and the environment of it, it was like, you are the only person in this class. I know I've heard that about law school, where it's like dog eat dog. And it's like, that can't be good for mental health, in terms of, also not a constructive way in terms of dealing with mental health. But yeah, those are just kind of some things off the top of my head that definitely, over the years, in terms of dealing with my own mental health and things like that, where I'm like, why is it that I got to do this alone all the time? Like, why is it that it's up to me to do this? Not that other people should help me and do all the stuff for me, but like, why can't this be more collaborative or cooperative?
Yeah, and I think that people end up with that individual kind of aspect. They end up with a lot of self-blame, right? Like this idea of everyone else can hack it and I just can't. And again, that kind of idea that if you don't do this, like if you don't access these resources, or if you don't work really hard on this paper, if you don't whatever, like that is your fault. That's a personal failing. And there was a conference that I was at on post-secondary mental health. This was a couple of years ago, but someone, and I feel bad that I don't remember who it was, but one of the panelists said, if all the frogs in a pond are sick, you don't look at the individual frogs, you look at the pond. Right. And that was their whole thing, was that like the culture of academia is an ill one. And I thought it was really interesting going into kind of my social work field that I'm in now, because it's, it's a grad school program, but it's also social work. And so we're learning about all these structural issues, right? We're learning that, the effects of poverty and the effects of racism, and the effects of homophobia, and all of this kind of real big structural stuff. But then in terms of academia, we still have this whole like, make sure that you personally make time for you personally to succeed. So how do you, and this is a question that I don't think necessarily has answers because I haven't found them yet, but how do you reconcile the idea of, I guess, free will? I guess it's like the idea that, individuals can still make choices, but that, like, how do you reconcile that with the whole idea of, there are these structures that are impeding individuals' abilities to make choices?
I mean, I don't want to compare us to robots, but the kind of similar thing, you put like, especially with AI and how they're working with AI and different things like that, you put parameters in place and you give something a logical framework. Not to say that we're always logical, because a lot of times we like to think we're more logical than we really are. We're emotional and logical at the same time. But it's like you put people in kind of a parameter and they're maybe going to act a certain way, right? So you have free choice, but up until a certain point that biology, psychology, sociology, all these other aspects in your life are kind of working either with or against you. And so I think it's also kind of just how we've been socialized by the institutions that we're involved in. So academia is very much, very old, kind of British stagnant kind of aspect of like, holders of knowledge, learners of knowledge, and that's kind of how it works out. And then also like the whole like publish or perish kind of aspect of academia is very like, that's not collaborative. I mean, there is kind of like a thing of collegialness, but I think that has its, there's kind of the veneer of collegiality, I think, that is talked about, and then there's kind of like what it's actually like. I think I remember here a quote saying, the best thing about being colleagues is that you're all colleagues. The worst thing about being colleagues is you're all colleagues. And so there's kind of like those aspects to it. But I think something that might help, which is kind of being worked in, is working in reconciliation and kind of indigenizing academia. I think that might hopefully have kind of a beneficial aspect to the way that our system works. Because I think, it'll be beneficial hopefully to have original peoples as well that attend academic institutions, but I cannot see how it'll be harmful to, set the settler community in Canada to have a more indigenized form of education. I think generally, historically, Indigenous cultures have been more democratic in terms of that, as well as more communal based in terms of social justice, as well as mental health and stuff like that too. So I don't see it as being, I think, our kind of generally combative or individualized thing. Like we've gotten to a point where it's becoming like there is an individual in society, but it's like it's become so much to a hyper extent that I think we need to take a step back and look at other options. And I'm hoping that kind of there's an honest approach towards indigenizing post-secondary education in other institutions that might also be of benefit.
Yeah, we've had some talk around indigenizing education in some of my courses, which is really interesting to me because I think and we hear this with like queering things too, right? Like we're gonna queer this institution, we're gonna queer this whatever. And sometimes queering things is really, really taking a queer theory, LGBTQ, like let's look at gender, let's look at sexuality, and really like digging in deep with it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes queering things is sticking a rainbow on it, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of the conversation we were having around indigenizing education is, is education as an institution really willing to like look at its colonial roots and look at, the role it's played in white supremacy and all this kind of stuff? Or are they looking to, do their land acknowledgements and nothing else, right?
Yeah, put the sticker on it, as you were saying.
Yeah.
And it's also kind of the way, like the whole intellectual property, you've got to put your name on the paper. You can't, the institution or like a group of people just couldn't publish it and nobody had a name on it kind of thing, right? That would blow people's minds to have like, and then it's like, it's still kind of privately held. Like it's still, the information is not like, it's meant to be for the public benefit, but you've got to go through like, I was just trying to look at articles and it's like, to look at an article for like 5 days is going to cost me $400 or something like that. Like I know they put in work to see it, but it's to do the research and stuff like that. But it's kind of like if we're at that point where there's, in order to get access to the information, how much is that really? Because it's got to go to almost that length, right? Knowledge being communal and stuff like that. But as well as just even the mental health side of the institution as well is still kind of there. We're still just getting at it where it's Band-Aid solutions, like you're in crisis, you go to the counseling services kind of thing, right? Like, and then you get to see somebody because you're in crisis. But we're still just getting into things where we're not talking about it in classes. The classes aren't being restructured, right? There's no restructuring of classes to be benefit to mental health, or it's just these baby millennials just can't handle the truth, and so they need help all the time. But it's like, there's obviously something amiss here. It's not just a generational issue. There's kind of given kind of social pressures and stuff like that. But there's more than just kind of like, as you're saying, there needs to be an authentic attempt. And I think that takes not letting the institution to do it, but we have to push for the institution to make those changes. We can't just sit back and be like, they'll do it, I swear. How many times has that come through? So, because then we get the sticker thing, right? Because they do it, people, take the brakes off a bit because they put the sticker on it, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. But I think you're right in terms of, it's like there's the sticker attempt, and that kind of is annoying as well when you're like, you were really hoping for something, and then you just get that nice sticker. Although getting a magnet would be nice, though. I don't know how it's gonna.
A magnet, like a Crazy Talk magnet. I see what you did. So we ordered these magnets. They're magnets with the Crazy Talk logo on them. I'm not super sure what I'm going to do with these magnets yet. I have 50 of them. And if you want to find out what I'm going to do with them, you can follow my Facebook page, facebook.com/LeeThomasSpeaks, because I will be making some sort of decision around these 50 magnets at some point. Thank you for that segue, Cody Jack.
You're welcome. Not too bad at segues.
I did want to talk about, you talked about this kind of millennial, like, oh, millennials are so weak, millennials just can't hack it. And I think that's something that we hear in mental health circles a lot. This idea that millennials, are somehow lying about their symptoms. There was a study that came out saying that high school students today, I might be misquoting this a little bit, but it was saying something like high school students today are as stressed out, or their anxiety levels are as high as psychiatric patients in the 70s. And I think there was a study out of New York. And I remember when I was working in insurance and that study came out, and everyone was kind of like, oh, there's no way that could possibly be true. And so because it couldn't possibly be true, that means that, these millennials are inflating how stressed they are.
Right.
I also want to throw out there that millennials are now like, between my age and 40. Like millennials are not necessarily high school students anymore.
No.
But I thought that was really interesting, the idea that millennials are somehow being disingenuous about how stressed they are.
Well, it's earlier generations' disbelief at stress almost. Like they're like, we went through tough things too. And so again, it's kind of like the disbelief and not understanding kind of the social reality of our times as well. And so like they're not affected as much as we are. And as well, I hate to bring up that guy, but the guy who I shall not be named, who is a Canadian academic and quote unquote psychologist. And he talks about like, if you just accepted things, life would be better. And so I think there is an aspect to that, but it's also like fighting for things is important too. And there's a reason why we do that, but it can be stressful on your mental health because you recognize things that are incorrect. And that is an actual stressful concept. Like to see injustice in the world and to be fighting against injustice is not an easy thing to do. And we have to definitely applaud people who fight for and fight against injustice, not fight for injustice, but fight for justice, fight against injustice. But, you have to applaud these people because, like yourself included, like it takes a lot of strength to kind of get through these things. Whereas people who are maybe from a more privileged background or from a better socioeconomic status or other things like that, to struggle every day can take a lot out of you. And I think it can draw back to that socioeconomic status thing where it's like eventually you hit the, like, you can't do it, like it doesn't keep going anymore. And so I think younger people, they link it to like younger people are more pro-socialism, stuff like that now and stuff like that. So I think, you could draw in that millennials are more in tune with kind of injustice and they understand what injustice is. And so maybe that could be actually causing larger amounts of anxiety. This is all kind of speculative, but it's like, I think there is an aspect to realizing injustice and fighting injustice and mental health. And I think we don't prepare ourselves, people who fight kind of social inequality and stuff like that. We don't have a good mental health practice. And we don't collectively take color of each other mental health wise. I think we almost have like a warrior mentality too on that front where it's like, toughen up, people have it worse than you do, buddy, living in North America, so what's your problem kind of thing. And I don't think that's a healthy way of looking at it when we're trying to better things up. So I think there's kind of an aspect where we also have to, people working in social justice have to look at our own mental health, because burnout in the social organizations is huge. And I don't think we talk about that either, which that could have been a whole show as well. That'd be interesting to talk about.
And I think it's one of those things where, like, partly the guilt might come from other people, but I think a lot of that kind of guilt comes from ourselves, where this, like, if I'm working with populations who are, like, marginalized in all sorts of ways that I'm not every day, then I might feel, bad that I feel bad, right? Like, so it becomes this, like, self-perpetuating cycle where it's like, oh, I'm having a really rough day today. How dare I have a rough day today? Because there are people who have it so much worse off than me, right? And so it's that kind of self-blame about, I just went to a workshop on the unified protocol for the transdiagnostic treatment of emotional disorders, which sounds real fancy, but ended up being a really interesting workshop. And they said that was actually one of the base factors that they looked at. It was not necessarily if you had kind of negative thoughts, emotions, and experiences, it was how you evaluated those. So if someone was like, oh, I'm having a real crap day, and then they were like, oh, well, sometimes people have crap days, but they noticed that there was a lot of emotional avoidance in people who would go, oh, I'm having a really terrible day. I shouldn't be having a really terrible day. I feel really bad because I'm having a really terrible day. And so I'm going to do all sorts of behaviors in order to avoid having to face the fact that I don't feel good. Which I just thought was really, really interesting. And I'm just going to throw that out there at the end of the show, I guess, and not address it anymore.
I think that's a good one. I think that's a great way. People are like, whoa, what do I got it? Oh, I guess you got to tune in next week to figure it out.
Tune in next week. So, Cody, thank you so much for being on the show, because we are out of time. So for the folks who are watching and are ready to, overthrow the bourgeoisie and all that sort of good stuff, what would you like our viewers to do next?
I think we were talking about getting involved in social organizations, and I think kind of social cohesion and stuff like that is actually beneficial to your mental health. And so I think getting out there and getting involved in something that matters to you, it could be anything from the knitting club down the street with the old ladies at the thing, that's your bag, do that up. But if, if you want to be more politically engaged and stuff like that, I'd encourage you to get out, but just try and get yourself engaged. The first step is, it seems daunting, but most people who are engaged in these things want you to help and want your help, and also want to get to know you better because you're interested in the same things as they are. So I think kind of getting over the social anxiety of talking with people, I have that myself, and it's like, once you get past that, I think the rewards will be there for you. Plus, then we get to benefit from more people working towards social betterment. So that's awesome.
Okay, well, that's awesome. What a lovely note to end us on. So thanks again, Cody, for being on the show. I really appreciate this conversation. And for those of you who are watching, whether you're watching live or watching the replay, if you're going, wow, Crazy Talk is so much fun, I want to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox, you can do that by signing up for my mailing list. You can sign up for my mailing list at leethomas.ca, and I will also be putting a link to it in the comments below. And when I decide what I'm going to do with these magnets, my mailing list will be the first to know. So thank you all so much, and be sure to tune in next week again at 6 o'clock Mountain Time on next Wednesday.